Railways, a vital part of the world's infrastructure, keeping people moving, goods rolling and times changing, connecting people from the giant hubs of the world in Paris, London, Brussels and Berlin to the likes of Ambergate, Llanfair, Pwyngogo, Gogegoch and Dropeth, Canticilio, Gogogoch, Thurso and Sheringham. Today is the 27th of September 2025, the same day that 200 years ago, in 1825, the Stockton and Darlington Railway opened and ushered in the age of the train. And now, 200 years later, I join Team 200 in recreating this historic journey. I'm currently rocketing across the country at 140 miles per hour along High Speed 1. High-speed rail is often considered to be the pinnacle of rail engineering and ingenuity. But how did we get here? How did we get from 200 years ago, locomotion number 1, hauling people in a wagon across the Stockton and Darlington Railway, to now high-speed electric multiple units with comfortable seats, hauling millions of people a day across countries? Well, to find out, we have to head towards London. And arriving in London off of Britain's newest main line, High Speed 1, we can't go immediately to where high-speed rail meets conventional railways. This is because there's still a lot of evolution and innovation to get through. Luckily, London is an absolute hive of railway innovation and evolution. So let's start with what London is probably most famous for: the tube. The London Underground is a vast and expansive network. We are going to go on every single tube stop, starting with the newest, the S-Stock. The S-Stocks were constructed by Bombardier between 2008 and 2017. The first unit entered service in 2010 on the Metropolitan line. It was an S8 stock, like this train. The S7 stocks, used on the Circle, District and Hammersmith and City lines, have 7 coaches instead of 8 and do not feature transverse seating. Now, interestingly, the newest tube stocks are actually on the oldest tube line, which is actually the oldest metro line in the world. The Metropolitan line was built in 1863, and yet it has the newest tube trains in London. Pretty interesting. on this national rail train as to keep continuity with the tube trains, because obviously we wouldn't want to be getting on a tube train we're supposed to be getting on later, earlier than we're supposed to, because what would be the point in that? So taking this into London to then get an 09 stop. We're not going to stay on this long in order to save you from the suffering of a 2009 stop. These trains were introduced in 2009 to replace the aging 67 stock tube trains. Now we turn back our clocks to before the turn of the millennia, to the Jubilee Line, 1996 stock. The Jubilee Line 1996 stock was built to replace the 1989 stock previously introduced on the line. The 1996 stock was built specifically for the Jubilee Line extension, which opened in 2000 and featured platform edge doors. The 96 stock is famous for having a bright and airy interior and the phony motor sounds. And as you see here at London Bridge on the Jubilee Line extension, they did indeed feature platform edge doors, which is why the 1996 stock had to be introduced. But there's another tube stock that is very similar to the 1996 stock, the 1995 stock, and that is on the Northern Line. The London Underground 1995 stock was procured to replace the 59 stock, the 62 stock, and the 72 stock. They were built by Alstom, and unlike their 1996 counterparts, they don't feature the funny motors, and the interiors feel a lot stuffier. And after our brief stint on a 1995 stock, we now head to go on a 1992 stock, one of London Underground's most controversial units. The London Underground 1992 stocks were built to replace the 1962 stocks in use on the Central Line. But these trains are infamous for their raging and boiling temperatures and their relative uncleanliness. Meanwhile, the 1992 stocks will be getting a refurbishment, including LED lighting, new passenger information screens that are dot matrix, new seat maquettes, and new motors for increased reliability and efficiency. The same cannot be said for our next train, the 1973 stock. The 1973 stocks were built to replace the 1959 stocks in use on the Piccadilly line. They were built off the same chassis as the 1967 stock found on the Victoria line. But unlike the Victoria Line 67 stock, they do feature a cab door, where the Victoria Line stock did not. This is because the Victoria Line, unlike the Piccadilly line, is completely automatic, whereas the Piccadilly line still has some manually driven sections. The 73 stock's replacement is imminent with the upcoming 2024 stock. Now, you may think, with the 1973 stock's imminent replacement in London, that they would be the oldest tube stocks currently in service in London. But you'd be mistaken, for we have to go one further, back down to 1972. The 1972 stock fleet was initially ordered to supplement the 1959 stock fleet on the Northern Line. However, pending withdrawal of the 1938 stock fleet on the Bakerloo line, they were also allocated to the Bakerloo line. Now, they share the same body construction as the 1967 stock that could be found on the Victoria line, including the absence of a cab door, despite sections of the Bakerloo line being completely manually driven. Now, some articles online will deceive you into thinking that the S8 stocks are the only stocks that feature transverse seating. However, this is not true, as the 1972 stocks still feature their original internal layout, which features transverse seating. Now, we've finished up with the tube. We've been on every single tube stock in London from the newest to the oldest. But the tube is not the only facet of London's railway network. Now, we're going to take a look at commuter trains. And oh wow, does it feel good to be in the sun again. This is a British Rail Class 707, originally entered service with South Western Railway, but now operates with South Eastern under the moniker of City B. They originally entered service with South Western Railway to replace the Class 455s, but when South Western Railway got rid of them in favour of the Class 701, South Eastern took them in and rebranded them to City B. Now they operate on South Eastern suburban and commuter routes across the southeast of England. The British Rail Class 707 is a member of the widespread and renowned Siemens Desiro family. Its subfamily is the Siemens Desiro City that consists of the 707, the 717 and the 700. The Desiro City competes for top shops in London for commuter trains with the Alstom Aventura, a member of which is the Class 701, which replaced these trains on South Western Railway. So, was it really worth replacing these fantastic units? Let's go and find out. The British Rail Class 701, part of the Alstom Aventura family of trains. From the get-go, these units were marred with multiple issues, such as poor reliability and lots of union disputes, like the window wiper being in the wrong position and poor amenities for guards. But eventually they did enter service 5 years late. And when they decide to work and turn on, they can be a real treat for the passenger. They feature multiple amenities that the 707s just did not feature, such as toilets, which is really useful for services that are over an hour, which these trains do operate. They suffer from the same ironing board seat problem that the 707 suffered with, but that's just modern trains. So the British Rail Class 701 features more what we'd call creature comforts in comparison to that of those on the Class 707. Where the 707s do not have toilets, the 701s do have toilets. But an argument can be made for operational ability as well, because the 701-0s are 10 cars long. But it's sort of nullified by the fact that 701-5s are 5 cars long like the 707s, meaning if you want a 10-car train, you have to couple 2 units together. But the argument for operational viability can be made because of the -0s, which are 10 cars long. The 707s feature a better ride quality and are overall a bit more reliable than the 701s though. Speaking of the 707s though, they must have evolved from somewhere, mustn't they? Let's have a look at a classic Desiro, the British Rail Class 450. The British Rail Class 450 was initially ordered to replace the slam door units that South Western Railway was using on their regional express and regional commuter routes. Because, you know, not quite intercity, but regional express. And for that they did a great job, but they've now been relegated to the commuter routes because of the slow rollout of the Class 701s and the hasty scrapping of the Class 455s, meaning that South Western Railway now has a gap in rolling stock, and this is what we call in the industry a bad thing, a bit of a cock-up. So, the Class 707 is an evolution of this design. Being a Desiro City, this is the base Desiro. This is the base Desiro UK, which is a very famous and very well-known and very renowned design. But the 701 also came from something, and that would be the Electrostar. Welcome on board the British Rail Class 377 Electrostar. The Electrostars are synonymous with commuter and regional travel across London and the southeast. The Electrostar is also the design in which the Class 701 evolved from. The Electrostar itself is a millennium update to the 1980s networker design. But to find out what the networker design was really like, I think we better just go on one. The Class 465 networker. They were introduced to replace the slam door stock of the 1960s and were a revolution when they entered service. But over time and lack of maintenance, their condition has slowly but surely deteriorated. We're sitting in a 465-9, and they're quite interesting because they were built by both Brel and Metro Camel, which is odd. Anyway, you may think that due to these trains' imminent replacement that these are the oldest commuter trains in London, but that award would go to our next candidate, the Class 455. This is a British Rail Class 455 electric multiple unit. It's a second generation EMU, which means it has the same carriage construction as units like the 150s, 769s, 319s, 321s, 320s, 317s, 318s, etc., etc. They were constructed in the 1980s in order to relieve the slam door units from the suburban lines of London. But something could say that these units are actually older than they say on the label because of the pep car in the middle, and the pep cars date back to the 1970s, meaning these trains could be as old as 50 years old by now. But they do not retain their original interior because they were refurbished in the early 2000s. In order to see their original interiors, we have to go to Scotland. So, me and the camera crew have a hotel booked in London, and we will see you bright and early in the morning to go on the 6 a.m. train out of London King's Cross. It's the dawn of a brand new day at London King's Cross, the southern terminus of the East Coast Mainline, one of the world's most prestigious and well-known main lines, home to many accolades like Flying Scotsman's first ever train to hit 100 miles per hour, and Mallard's record-breaking 126 miles per hour for a steam locomotive. And this morning, there is a chill in the air coming from the north. Standing next to me is a British Rail Class 803 IET. The IET is iconic for mixing both conventional railways and high-speed rail technology. But where did it begin? Where did we start mixing high-speed rail technology and high speeds with conventional railways? To find out, we have to take a trip on this thing and head up north. nothing quite like rolling across country, sitting back and relaxing on a train and just taking in the views, just watching the world go by. This Class 803 has been amazing for this. It has warm ambient lighting, lovely comfortable seats, and the views along the East Coast Mainline have been positively breathtaking. Absolutely stunning views along this beautiful and historic line. But we're heading to Edinburgh, and the reason we're heading to Edinburgh is the IETs, as controversial as they are, were initially made to replace a class of train that will forever be in the annals of history. The Intercity 125, an icon of British rail travel and ingenuity, and one of the most iconic trains ever built. They are also the fastest diesel trains in the world, with a top speed of 147 miles per hour. These are some of the most iconic trains on the British rail network today, with a history spanning decades. They turn 50 next year. So, I think it's time we take one last ride on these legends of British rail. We find ourselves in a very similar status to where we were on the IET. Zooming along the country, taking in all the views and just sitting back and relaxing. In these beautiful Mark III coaches, lovely and comfortable, lovely and smooth. The internal ambience is amazing. And it makes you really think back and reflect to the time when these were made, where Britain was at the forefront of rail innovation and we were really pioneering our way to the future. The HSTs were the first trains to really incorporate the idea of high-speed travel onto conventional lines. Hence why we are still able to travel at relatively high speeds on the conventional Highland Mainline. This is all thanks to the HST. It really was the age of the train. And arriving into Dundee, that concludes our trip on the legendary Intercity 125. You know, Dundee never really was the same since Zargathrax and his army of undead unicorns invaded, but that's besides the point. Here, we're going to sort of leave the evolution of the main line for a bit. We will come back to it, but I think it's time we go a bit more regional. This trip of just looking out the window and taking in the country as we roll on by on a train. This particular train is a Class 170 and it's a member of the Turbostar family of trains, and the Turbostars took the UK by storm. And you might recognize the Turbostar from earlier on in the documentary when we were talking about the Electrostar and we covered its electric counterpart. Now, Electrostars are very commonly used on commuter and suburban trains, whereas Turbostars have often found their footing in regional trains. And that concludes our journey on the Turbostar, an icon of the British regional railway network. But to truly understand what regional trains were like before the turn of the 2000s, we need to go here. The British Rail Class 156, one of the best examples of a British Rail second generation regional unit, built to replace the slam door stock that was on these lines through the 50s and 60s. These trains were a revolution when they entered service. So, let's take a ride and dive into the history of these magnificent units. This is the quintessential British regional unit. When you think of a British regional unit, you think of something like one of these shuttling up and down a little branch line all day in the middle of nowhere. They were built in the late 1980s to replace the slam door first generation stock from the late 1950s. But even more interestingly, their design was actually used as the basis for the British Rail Mark IV coach, which would be used in the legendary Intercity 225. as we conclude our little trip on the Class 156, we're going to park the British regional trains for a minute, and we're going to head over to the commuter trains again. But don't you worry, we will be back later to see the first generation of British GMUs. Standing beside me is a British Rail Class 318 electric multiple unit, specifically 318256. And as promised back in London, we are now going to take a look at a British Rail electric multiple unit that still retains its original interior. And we're here on the British Rail Class 318 electric multiple unit, and you can really get a sense for the level of comfort you can achieve on these trains, because as you can see, they are kitted out with their original seats, unlike the 455s, which were refurbished in the early 2000s and got new seats, but these retain their original seats. They were introduced to replace first generation multiple units, so the slam door units, the same reason that any second generation multiple unit was introduced. Enough about the past though, because for once we are now going to head to the future. We're going to head to see the newest tube train. Now, you'll remember, back in London, we went on every tube train currently in service in London. Starting with the newest, we went all the way down to the oldest. But what if I told you there is actually a newer tube train in service in the UK? And it's here. And for that, we have to go down. The new Glasgow subway trains, built by Stadler, were introduced last year to replace the old Glasgow subway trains from the 1980s, built by Metro Camel. They are the newest tube trains in Britain. Until the introduction of the new Piccadilly line trains next year, these are the only deep-level tube trains in the country to have some sort of air cooling or air conditioning system. They also have brand new passenger information screens and offer a sleek, modern and smooth ride for passengers travelling in Glasgow. And there you have it. This little fella is Britain's newest tube train. Little, yes, I said little. The Glasgow subway is built at a narrow gauge. Speaking of the narrow gauge, tomorrow we will continue our crusade through the main lines of Britain, discovering the history of mainline travel with the main line in miniature. So it's time for us to head back to London, get an early night's sleep and be up bright and early tomorrow. It's a brand new day, and I'm fueling up and heading along Britain's newest main line, High Speed 1. And we're heading along High Speed 1 to go and visit a main line that was built nearly 100 years ago and even saw action in the Second World War. Now, arriving in Sandling, we have to take a bus. Taking a bus through to Hythe to go on the Romney, Hythe and Dymchurch Railway, a main line in miniature. And we are here at Hythe on the Romney, Hythe and Dymchurch Railway to explore one of the final modes of rail travel for this documentary, the narrow gauge. We've explored everything in standard gauge, but now we hit the narrow gauge. And this is dubbed as the main line in miniature, with replica LNER A1 Pacific locomotives hauling trains on a double-tracked main line for 13 miles through the Kent countryside. So, let's go for a ride. And arriving into Dymchurch, you can really see that this is truly a main line in miniature, with two tracks, ferrying passengers across the Kent coastline for nearly 100 years. Speaking of 100 years, the line opened in 1927, but the locomotive hauling us was actually built in 1925. So as we celebrate 200 years of the railway, Green Goddess celebrates 100 years. The line operated during the Second World War, and was used as a sort of mobile aerial defense battery, and even claims to have shot down a plane. Today, the line operates both fast and slow services, with the fast services only stopping at New Romney, and the slow services stopping at every single station along the line. Now, to really take in the beauty and majesty of a steam engine, we need to head to Norfolk, to see the North Norfolk Heritage Railway, and really take us back to the golden age of railways. I will see you tomorrow. Good morning, bright and early from London Liverpool Street Station on the 26th of September 2025. One day before Railway 200, one day before we celebrate 200 years of the modern railway. But there is still one more age of railway travel we have yet to experience. One more age we have yet to explore. The Golden Age. So it's time for us to head east to Norfolk to explore the steam age of railway travel. And arriving off of our train from London, we now need to take one more train to Sheringham. That train being a British Rail Class 755 Flirt, which incidentally
is one of the most modern and advanced regional trains in the UK, with bimode capability, meaning it can run under both overhead electric wires and it can run on diesel power. It also has charging points at each seat, and probably most astonishingly, universal level boarding, which is just astounding and amazing, and it's an amazing step forward in railway innovation, ingenuity, and technology. So, we're taking that to go on one of the oldest DMUs in the UK. The British Rail Class 755 was ordered by Greater Anglia and constructed by Stadler Rail of Switzerland. They were ordered to replace Greater Anglia's Licorice all-sorts fleet of regional trains. This consisted of Class 153s, 156s and Class 170 Turbostars. They entered service in 2020 and were the first trains in the UK to feature universal level boarding. Over their 5-year career so far, they have also managed to become the UK's most reliable train. The Flirt offers a sleek, modern and comfortable ride through North Norfolk and Defence. But now it's time to go on something much, much older. The British Rail Class 101, probably the quintessential first generation multiple unit. When you think of a first generation multiple unit, this is what you think of. Our endeavours through the commuter and regional multiple units of the UK have all led to this point. The British Rail Class 101 was introduced in the 1950s and 60s, so they are really old. They're really old units. And other examples of first generation multiple units include the Class 104, which is actually on the other end of this unit. They've jerry-rigged the two together. And another example of a first generation multiple unit, probably most famously, is the Class 117, which is very prevalent on many heritage railways. I have a massive soft spot for first generation DMUs. I think there's something just so quaint and adorable about them. They have so much character to them. So, let's go for a ride on this adorable little thing, and then it's time for the steam train. This is a British Rail Class 104 DMU. It is a first generation DMU. However, it is derived from the British Rail Mark II carriage, whereas the Class 101 on the other end is derived from the British Rail Mark I carriage. However, it remains a first generation DMU. And well, we've made it back to the first generation. We've made it back to where British Rail DMUs began. So where to go from here? Well, the path is obvious. Steam. This beautiful beast is the absolute mammoth 210 Royal Norfolk Regiment. An absolute marvel of engineering. It was constructed in 1943 in Glasgow for the War Department fleet. And although it was constructed for the British and for the War Department fleet, it actually spent most of its service life in Greece, only being returned to Britain when it left service in Greece. It now resides here at the North Norfolk Heritage Railway. So, I think that's enough talking. Let's go for a ride on this marvel of engineering. Now, of course, it wouldn't be proper to take a ride on this beast and just sit in a coach on a seat taking in the views. No, the real way to enjoy a steam engine like this is out the window. And with this beast behind us, we have truly made our way to the golden age of railway travel, where steel dragons would haul thousands of people across the country for days on days on end. Now there's only one thing left to do. The 27th is coming close. It is time to celebrate Railway 200 and recreate the first ever railway journey. For now, me and the camera crew are going to enjoy a day on the railway, and we'll see you bright and early tomorrow. And we're here, the 27th of September 2025, 200 years since the inception of the railways. So much has changed, so much innovation and technology has changed, and yet the core concept of the train has stayed the same. The core concept of steel on steel has remained all the way from 1825 all the way through to 2025. So we're here, London King's Cross, the terminus of the East Coast Mainline, and it's time for us to head north to Darlington for the Stockton and Darlington Railway. And so we arrive into Darlington, one of the namesakes on the Stockton and Darlington Railway. Weirdly enough though, the first train did not leave from either Stockton or Darlington. It left from Shildon. And we're here at Shildon, roughly the same place where the first railway journey began back in 1825. And now we join with Team 200 to recreate this historic journey.
Hey! In 1825, we stretched to bring the track on time. We stretched to bring the track on time to work the colliery railroads. Diddly-orry-irie-ay, 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 to work the colliery railroads.
So the reason why I'm doing this trip, obviously, it's a significant part of railway history. When it all started 200 years ago to this point, it's massive, and celebrate this amazing milestone of how far we've come and to the future as well. So here's to the future of the railway.
Next station stop is North Road.
So this idea started way before the three-day festival that's currently happening here in County Durham, and decided to reach out to as many people as I could possibly think of who would probably want to come to a fun, engaging train enthusiast event like this. Haven't organised anything like it before, and eventually we did get around 6 people to agree to come, and it's a really important gathering because as we celebrate Rail 200, we need to make our mark in history and to also capture that history for people to view. We'll have Railway 250 in 50 years' time. They'll be able to look back at our archival footage and say, this is what Railway 200 looked like. And they really wanted to celebrate that history, and we should too. It's just about making your mark now, and so that people in the future can look back on it and really appreciate the railway that we've built for them through the different jobs that people in our transport enthusiast community work in, and also the involvement that we have in shaping the future of the railways. So this is important because we can all get together and just celebrate Rail 200 on the most important day of the year.
Okay, so the journey's almost over now. We've just left North Road and we'll be arriving into the main Darlington soon. It's been a fun little journey, but it's been a short little journey as well. It's gone, oh my goodness, look at all the people down there. We've got to get a shot of that on the way back. But yes, this railway, I mean, what can I say? This is where it all began, right? It's clearly a very important moment. There is an interesting debate over whether this first proper railway was the Stockton and Darlington or whether it was the Liverpool and Manchester. Liverpool and Manchester was a lot more advanced. It had proper designated stations, it ran to a timetable, and it had many elements of the modern railway, whereas this was possibly more similar to a lot of the industrial tramways. But there is still the fact that it used steam and it was a public railway and that it carried passengers. So I think very important, whatever, you know, whether you consider it to be the first or not, it's incredibly important that we recognise how historically significant this railway is.
And we're here at the Skerne Bridge on the Stockton and Darlington Railway, the location of possibly one of the most famous railway paintings ever. And it really makes you think. There's been so much innovation and so many incredible people over the course of the railway's history. And we haven't even scratched the surface of railways. We haven't even talked about light rail, for example. But we don't have time for that now. So I implore you all to do your own research. But it does make me think, in 200 years' time, what will the railway look like and who will have shaped it from now?